That's my job. My job is to support you guys. Well, amongst other things.
Right. Okay. Right. Good afternoon then, and good afternoon, Dr. Clayton. I'm going to actually introduce you to the audience this afternoon. My name's Scott Burgess. I'm a platinum in the Zinzino business, and it's my pleasure to talk to you again this afternoon. We're making this quite a regular occurrence, Dr. Clayton. We spoke last week, and we're speaking this week again. I'm going to introduce you to the wider audience because not everybody will have spoken to you. I'm sure they've heard of you, but they've not spoken to you before. So, in terms of your illustrious career, I've made some notes to myself. And in terms of looking at you, Paul, obviously you're one of the leading scientists in the world of nutrition and an advisor to Zinzino, which is excellent. I took some quotes actually from your website this afternoon, and I'm going to quote you, if I may, which is say you describe yourself as a clinical pharmacologist and pharmaconutritionist. You quote yourself as obsessing about food and nutrition and health, and so that other people don't have to, unless they want to. I'm actually quoting you literally here. Either way, you're welcome to drop in for science updates, analysis, opinion, and bits of advice about diet and health, and debate if you're not into the whole brevity thing. So I thought that was quite...
Wait, it's important to point out, that is a Big Lebowski reference, for those of you who don't already know.
Oh, okay. Didn't actually appreciate that. But I was going to say, I don't think we'll be doing brevity this afternoon because I am looking to try and drill down a bit more this afternoon. So I just want to explain that when you're not advising Zinzino or other healthcare companies, that you're designing clinical trials or preclinical trials for pharmaconutrition intervention with various doctors and scientists around the world. You're either chairing international meetings, which clearly you can't do at the moment, given the lockdown situation we're facing. You're lecturing in universities to up-and-coming or existing students who are hanging on your every word, I'm sure. But I think one of the most important things I've noticed about you is obviously your downtime is limited, because I've always wanted to write a book, but you seem to have written loads in your illustrious career, and they're all very, very, very obviously well utilised by a lot of our audience today who've been inspired by you. And I know that from working with people recently who obviously you've lectured to them over various years, may I say decades, Paul, and a lot of them have been inspired and actually part of our business as a result of that today. Books are Health Defence, After Atkins, Natural Defences, Out of the Fire, and Let Your Food Be Your Pharmaconutrition. And I'm aware that you've also released a new book this week. Not proposing to talk about that obviously in any detail, but Strengthening Your Immune System, How to Fight Infection, Allergy, and Autoimmune Disease. So a very, very apt title given the current situation that we're facing. So thank you very much for attending this afternoon and being part of this afternoon for us. Like I said, we've got doctors on, nutritionists, functional medics, medical practitioners and naturopaths. And what I want to do really is to focus more on the four categories that we have within the business. So clearly we've got four distinct areas that we focus on, which is the immune system, the balance, if you like, category of products, weight loss, and the skin serum. And I'd like, with the time we got today, to explore all of those areas. And I'm going to ask you questions, if I may, Paul, once we've actually explored the products themselves. What I want really is for the audience to understand the pharmacology and the mode of action a bit more behind the products and why we consider them to be best in class. I think that's the starting point today. And then as we explore that, if we can look at the degenerative disease areas that the products obviously can help with, I think is probably the best expression we can use, and look at that in relation to the immune system, particularly given the current situation with COVID-19, and how the products work synergistically together as well, how they work individually and together. And one final point before we start talking about the products is that I've noticed from reading your books and my observations that there's a very clear distinction where Zinzino is, which is we've got the pharmaceutical world on the one side, which obviously I know well. We have the supplement world on the other opposing side. And in the middle is this area of pharmaconutrition, which you've pioneered over the decades, as I've said. I think the most important thing that I've understood from this and want people to take away today is that our products are very much aimed at the depletion of nutrition and vitamins within society now, and then the repletion of those same vitamins and minerals that are so important to us by utilizing our products. So without further ado, could we start by looking at balance oil, please, Paul? And if I explain that we have a range of products, so we have balance oil plus, the vegan oil, Essent, and Aqua X. Could we just talk around, obviously, those products to begin with, please?
Sure. Well, I mean, let me pick up on a couple of things that you said. I think this area of pharmaconutrition, and that's still not a universally accepted name, let alone a definition, is somewhere in this area bounded by foods which are currently a mess, pharmaceuticals, which I regard as almost unbearably primitive, and supplements, which until very recently has been entirely neglected and under-controlled and fraudulent area. So I don't like any of those three industries. And one of the problems that we have at a public health level today is that for historical reasons, we have developed a magic bullet style of medicine. It's a central part of medical training. And it was, for anyone who knows their medical history, I think initially valid at the time when this model was first being developed, because at that time, infectious diseases were the most important causes of morbidity and mortality. But they're not an appropriate approach if you're trying to deal with the problems which are more important today, which are largely, not exclusively, but largely chronic degenerative disease. And you see, you can find a point of metabolic or chemical differential between a man and a microbe, but it's not possible to do that when you're dealing with chronic degenerative diseases, which are by and large, not strictly speaking diseases at all, but syndromes, which are driven by multiple metabolic errors, which are in turn have their roots in environmental factors, primarily dietary. So almost everything we do is based on this depletion-repletion model, where we're consuming very little calories these days. We're physically very inactive, so we're eating historically low amounts of food. The foods that we do eat have a very low nutrient density, so we're dealing with a population that is actually pretty sick. They're chronically intoxicated by the modern diet. So they have a combination of two things. They have chronic inflammatory stress, which leads to the accelerated destruction of healthy tissue. And at the same time, they have type B malnutrition, which means that the body doesn't have all the cofactors and building blocks it needs to restore and regenerate that destructive process with new healthy tissue. So we become anabolically disabled, we become catabolically dominant, and over time, what we actually see is the slow erosion of bone, cartilage, artery linings, skin. And that's a large part of the aging process that we see today. So what we try to do is to compensate for that by, with this very small portfolio, which is designed, it's part of an EBN approach, evidence-based nutrition. We rely very heavily on the work of many hundreds, actually thousands, I should say, of good scientists, and some great ones, some of whom I've been privileged to meet. And what we do is to try and create an anti-inflammatory environment in the body without causing immunosuppression, and there's ways of achieving that. And then we try to replace all the missing cofactors that are really very badly depleted in the modern diet. When we do those two things, what we see is that chronic degenerative disease tends to stabilize, and often it goes into remission. And very surprisingly, at first, although we don't find it so surprising anymore, we find that in many cases, symptoms start to regress and patients become less pharmaceutically dependent and in many cases become drug-free. This is heresy, of course, if you're an orthodox medic, which, and I was once an orthodox clinical scientist. But our thinking has really changed, partly as a result of some of the interventions that we've had a hand in. So thank you, especially to all the doctors, clinical scientists, and nutritionists who are joining it at this point. You're not the enemy to me, you are my colleagues. And it's very important for me to maintain links and bridges and open communication with you. We try to be very transparent. Everything is written up in books, in scientific papers. I've got 2 papers on the stocks now, one with a group of excellent South Korean scientists, where we're looking at lysosomal stabilization and its impact on skin aging. And then another very nice little study in Australia, with a very good group of people there, where we're looking at the impact of 1,3-beta-glucans on viral infection frequency. So coming back to balance oil, when you look at the modern food space, it's characterized by the removal of a number of anti-inflammatory nutrients, very important, that used to be in the diet are really being taken away. And they include the omega-3 long-chain fatty acids and the accompanying lipophile polyphenols. So we put them back in balance oil, and we use different formulations to achieve that. We have another formulation which is designed to rectify type B malnutrition and at the same time improve the immune function, that's extend. And then we have another tool which is used to flip the microbiome from being predominantly gram-negative to positive, and that acts as an anti-inflammatory source within the large intestine, which you cannot reach with omega-3s and polyphenols. Coming back to balance oil, I think that all of the medics present, all the clinical scientists will know very well that although there is good epidemiological evidence to support the increased consumption of fish, and particularly cold water marine fish with high levels of omega-3s. We know all this, and yet we have a plethora of prospective randomized clinical trials where we have used fish oil to try and reduce the risk of various cardiovascular endpoints, neurological, neurodegenerative endpoints, and others, and they've all failed. So there's a huge conceptual chasm to bridge here. Why is it that eating oily fish is a good idea, but fish oil doesn't work? We now have a better idea as to what that is. Fish oil, or oily fish, is more than just omega-3s. And what we have done is to reconstitute basically the fish in liquid form. We've put the lipophile polyphenols back in. That has a huge impact. First of all, let me say that you never see omega-3s in nature on their own, the long chain ones. They are always accompanied by these polyphenols. You never find them on their own. And the reason why they're so important to use them together is that the polyphenols act as chaperones for the omega-3s in the marine ecosystem and in the body. Now we have a database of close to 500,000 cell membrane samples now. And we know, what we have found is that people who simply take fish oil have terrible 6:3 ratios. The omega-3s aren't getting to the peripheral tissues where they are needed. We know that when we give them the balance oil, which adds the polyphenols and protects them, that in these people, the 6:3 ratios start to drop, and then everything cleans up. Symptoms of inflammation start to disappear. It takes about 120 days to do that. We can't speed it up. But the importance of the polyphenols is twofold. Not only is it delivering the omega-3s to the peripheral tissues, but it is also, once it gets to the peripheral tissues, acting as a downstream anti-inflammatory component in its own right. So if you think of the inflammatory sequence as a chain of events, a cascade of events, if you like, the omega-3s are interfering with that sequence at the top end. The polyphenols are blocking the sequence lower down. And it's the additive effect of these two anti-inflammatory agents that makes balance oil so different. This has all been published. In fact, I first wrote about this in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine 4 or 5 years ago. And I said, look, fish oil doesn't work. And this is the reason why, and this is how to make it work. The response of the fish oil industry was absolutely predictable. I was going to conferences, and these big companies, and it's $1 billion industry, were literally screaming at me. They tried to bar the doors. They wouldn't even allow me into some of the conferences because what I was saying was considered to be so threatening to the industry. But what has happened is that little by little, those voices have quietened down, and what we see now are increasing numbers of companies who are adopting our approach. Imitation, a sincere form of flattery. I'm pleased to hear that they're catching on and to see that more products are being released into the market which actually work. But I can assure you that we will be a couple of jumps ahead of them. We now have, as you know, Aqua X, which is a effectively a water miscible version of the omega-3s. And I'm currently working on a version of balance oil which will be effective from the first couple of doses without that very, very long time lapse between starting to take them and effectiveness. We actually can do that now. The chemistry, the clinical and preclinical evidence already exists to make this possible. It is now simply a question of negotiation with the regulators to actually allow us to do this. So what you see in our portfolio is the result of work that was done quite a long time ago. There's a lot more in the pipeline, and we're going to be developing each one of these products, and you will see them changing and evolving and improving as we go forwards.
Thank you, Paul. That's great. I think what I'm going to propose to do, there's some very interesting points you've just raised in there, and what I'm going to propose to do, as I said, is a Q&A session today with questions that have been sent to me by my colleagues within the business. So if I may, I'll ask you those questions as we go. They're quite random, and I know that's what you like best, though. So I'm going to I'll just put these to you as we go. Clearly, there's a rationale behind using vitamin D within the balance oil. And by the way, Paul, have you got a bridge on a dog on the bridge with you at the moment? I was just going to say, because I seem to be able to hear a dog barking. Is that yours?
I think it must be some form of alien life that sounds like a dog.
Okay, you're not a dog in your presence, all right? That's fine. It sounds like
I honestly don't know where it is.
Right.
There are dogs around in this building, and if it's distracting, let me see what I can do to quieten things down. Would you give me a minute? Let me see what I can do.
Of course, yeah, of course, yeah.
Scott, how did you muster up the courage to ask him about a dog? I haven't even heard it once.
You are such a fibber.
Well, I thought given the number of
I love watching all the intelligent comments in the chat. Whose dog's that? Whose dog's that?
Absolutely. By the way, whilst we got this break for a second, can you hear my microphone okay now? Can you give me? Yeah, you can. Great.
It's when you drop it down. When you drop it down, it goes all rapidly.
Okay, fine. I appreciate that. Thank you. Paul, you can hear me loud and clear, yeah?
Yeah, no problem.
Excellent. We seem to have sorted the dog out as well, which is great. Okay, just continuing where we were. So question-wise, the rationale behind vitamin D, if you would please, within the balance soil, and what is the research based on, was the first question.
Well, the amount of vitamin D in balance oil is actually very, very small. The regulators have quite strict limits on vitamin D administration, which I think are actually profoundly wrong. But nonetheless, we must adhere to them. And we felt that it was a good idea to add just a trace of vitamin D because the evidence of hypovitaminosis D is it's very good, and the condition itself is very prevalent. There is persuasive, I wouldn't say absolutely conclusive, but there is persuasive evidence that being low in vitamin D for much of the year, as most of us in the temperate zones are, may increase the risk of a number of health conditions, including possibly some of the autoimmune diseases and possibly certain cancers and maybe even certain types of neurodegenerative conditions. This is evidence of various qualities, and I'm not going to say that this is completely proven, but I tend to go along with some of this. So the idea of adding a little vitamin D into the product is sort of derives from that. It's not what I would consider to be a high or necessarily even pharmacologically active dose of D, but we do what we can. Okay,
that's great. Thank you, Paul. I've got quite a lot of questions actually surrounding balance soil, so we'll rattle through these if we may. Are there any issues with seafood intolerances and or histamine intolerances with the balance oil?
No, not at all. When people say that they are intolerant to seafood, what that actually means is that they have become allergic to the protein components. Most allergens are proteins or glycoproteins or related structures. Not all of them, but predominantly. And there are none of those in balance oil, which is rigorously purified. There's no protein component whatsoever. What you have there is 99.9999% lipid. And although it is possible to develop an autoimmune response to phospholipids, which is the basis of Hughes syndrome, for those of you who know about these things, it's not possible to be allergic to something as simple as a fatty acid. You just can't do that.
Okay.
So not a problem there.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Paul. And related to that question was, does the combining of polyphenols increase histamine reactivity, or is it actually a modifier which makes it more tolerable?
They're actually a favorable modifier. Much of the downstream histamine sequence involves, it's a kind of, it overlaps with the inflammatory sequence. And so by putting anti-inflammatories into the system, you're actually going to reduce the intensity of any of the symptoms that you would associate with histamine intolerance.
Okay,
indeed, some of the polyphenols actually have the ability to stabilize mast cells. And so that's generally a pretty good thing to do in people who develop histamine overload symptoms as a response to exposure to whatever it is that they're intolerant of.
That's excellent. Thank you, Paul. And moving on to the vegan balance oil, which clearly is a significant development as it's a patented product within the business for us. Could you just explain the conversion efficacy compared to, say, the conventional balance oil? And there's two parts to this question. How is it considered in terms of as a product currently for us? Is the efficacy of vegan oil improved over conventional vegan oil, for example? I think I know the answer to that clearly, but we're going to ask it nonetheless because of the combination of the polyphenol content with the vegan oil. If you could just expand on that, I could say, together with the conversion efficacy, if you would.
Well, when you talk about the traditional vegan oils, were you in fact talking about flaxseed, hemp seed oil, that kind of thing? Because if so, they're a complete waste of time. I mean, it's hardly even worth talking about those. Because the body's ability to put those short-chain fatty acids through the elongation desaturation sequence that is required is very much affected by the short-chain omega-6s that people are eating. You can, make up everything that you need, providing you keep that ratio below 4:1, because these particular enzymes, which are involved in that transformation for both the 3s and the 6s, have an affinity for the 3s, which is about 4 times greater than they are for the 6s. So you can bring a 6-to-3 ratio up to about 4:1, and at that point, you're still capable, the body is still capable of making what it needs. But that's not true. Really, it's very difficult to do that anymore because you look at the current food space, it's so overloaded with omega-6s. So trying to top up with a flaxseed oil or hemp seed oil, you won't do it. And I think the people selling those products are selling basically a confidence trip. I think it's dishonorable. If you're talking about vegan oils derived from marine algae, well, that's of course where the omega-3s in fish oil come from anyway. Fish don't make omega-3s, they derive it from the marine ecosystem. At the bottom of that system, the lowest trophic level, are the plants, just as they are on the land. And whereas land plants are making predominantly omega-3s, the marine cold water plants are making, terrestrial plants, omega-6, the marine cold water plants are making these omega-3s. And because these molecules are so fragile, the same seaweeds are making the fluorotannins, the lipophilic polyphenols, which then co-migrate with the omega-3s all the way through the food chain. The composition, the ratio of 6s to 3s varies slightly in different trophic levels because different species are abstracting and using slightly different amounts of the longer chain omega-3s, SDA, EPA, DHA. And so the profile changes a little bit as you go to krill, pelagic fish, larger fish, marine mammals, and then to the apex predator. But basically, we're pretty good at taking what we need out of these mixed sources of omega-3s. And whether you start off with the seaweed, the marine algal extract, or the fish oil, or whether, like the Greenlanders do, the Inuit, you go straight to whale oil, or chewing whale blubber, which I've tried and I don't recommend, then the body will take what it needs. And both EPA and DHA have pretty good anti-inflammatory effects. You might want slightly more of one than of the other at different times of the body's development, but providing they're both there, the body will take what it needs. And it even has the capability of some slight it can actually metabolize one to the other, and even but it works both ways, not very effectively, but the body will eventually take out what it needs.
Okay, thank you, Paul. That's excellent. And in terms of one of the doctors within the business has asked, the vegan balanced oil going forward, would you consider it to be the preferred product? I say preferred product. It will be. You've talked about the product becoming more available, given the engineering, if you like, and the production of it becoming more available as time goes on. In terms of it being more sustainable, I think that's an important point to point out, and it's been actually asked. Would you see that as the future, and also looking at GLA in combination with the echem oil, would you see that being added to other balanced oil ranges in the future?
I think that the bioreactors do provide a more sustainable source than the oceans, and of course the bioreactors are infinitely upscalable. All you have to do is to extend the length of the polytubing, and you increase the production capacity of your plant. Plus, there is no concern about pollutants, environmental contaminants, and you don't have to worry about overfishing. You can produce as much of these things on dry land as you can under very controlled and extremely clean conditions. Until now, the product has been expensive because really there just aren't that many of these bioreactors available, but they're multiplying. Production capacity is increasing. The vegan oil from these sources will, I think, it'll become commoditized. Prices will fall. And at that point, I think it will become, for us, probably the main product. And don't forget also that it's, of course, acceptable to vegans and vegetarians. And we have them in increasing numbers in our community. And I think that's another reason for us to continue to go down this road.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thanks, Paul.
By the way, with regard to adding GLA to other products, that is something that's under consideration. But I just want to leave you with the idea that there's other omega fatty acids that are equally important. Now, some of you may have come across skiadonic acid, which is somewhat atypical. It's not part of the framework that we tend to think about very much. It's derived from a number of temperate zone plants, specifically conifers, and there's a strong ethnobotanical background. It has anti-inflammatory effects of its own, which seem to be a little bit different and distinct from those which are conferred by SDA, EPA, DHA. And so at the moment, although it's extremely expensive, probably out of our price range, I think that the price of that will come down. When it does, we will probably start to add that to our products as well, increasing their anti-inflammatory potency.
Okay, so the addition of GLA and then the echem oil as well, is that a possibility?
Yes, like as I said, it's under consideration. Yeah.
Okay, fine. And the question that's just come in literally, given the efficacy of that oil, is that why it's a smaller 200 ml bottle and a smaller dose?
That's a part of it, but I think it also reflects the premium price of the raw material. That will change.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Paul.
Moving. Sorry, just to let you know, that is turning into a 300 ml bottle.
That's interesting.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you, Dave. Yes, thank you for that.
Someone's just flagged up that there's more barking. I don't know if it's my end, but can you give me another minute? Let me go and see what's going on.
Of course I can. No worries. No
All right. I do apologize.
Okay.
One of the announcements through corporate newsletter communication about a week and a half to maybe 2 weeks ago was the vegan oil being sized to 300 ml. There it is, behind you, Scott.
No, I'm just being informed about my microphone. Actually, is it still going in and out? Can't hear you now.
I said your good lady was behind you.
I know, she's informing me. Thank you. Hopefully we'll have Paul back in. Oh, okay, Paul, you're back. Lovely. We seem to have lost the dog. That's excellent. Okay, moving on to the next question then. Again, could you give us some guidance in terms of the upper limits of the oil I think that would be something really quite significant. I've heard you talk about it before in terms of people can overuse the oil. And so what would you consider to be the safe therapeutic dose for the oil?
Well, if you stay within the normal dosage guidelines, which are expressed in terms of mil per kilogram body weight, that will take you to the right kind of end zone. We'd like most people to be below 5, 6 to 3, in terms of 6:3 ratio. In some cases, it may be necessary to try to dip below that if there is an active inflammatory condition that you want to deal with. You may have to bring the ratio down to 4, 3, 2, in some cases below 2, for very serious health conditions. If it's absolutely critical to stop the chronic inflammatory sequence. And I think that what many people do is actually they will titrate themselves, and they'll bring the ratio down until whatever the problem is that they're dealing with, whatever the inflammatory symptoms are, they will bring the ratio down to the point that those symptoms abate. Now, it is possible to overdose. You can kill yourself with water if you drink too much of it. And I do not recommend going below 1.5 without medical supervision. If you bring the ratio down to 1 or go negative, and I've seen some people, enthusiastic self-medicators doing this, you will reach a point where you can't really, the blood is unable to clot. And at this point, effectively, you're becoming hemophiliac or close to it. That's not a good place to be. I do not recommend it.
No, understandably so. Okay, that's fine. And Paul, a really very pertinent question. Again, we're talking about the benefits of our products clearly within the immune system, and I know it relates particularly to the innate immune system. But the question is simply, in terms of the use of omega-3 and the scientific evidence behind it, in terms of the benefits, just simply the benefits it has to the immune system, if you would, please.
You know, extend is really more about the functioning of the innate immune system.
We're going to talk about that in a moment, but
yeah, but the point of balance oil is that if you have an excessive 6:3 ratio, and the European average is now 15:1, the North American average is now 25:1, and we think from an evolutionary perspective it should probably be more like 3 or 4:1. Then you have a near certainty of developed chronic inflammatory stress and chronic inflammatory damage to various tissues. The chronic inflammatory system or cascade itself involves immune cells. By using balance oil to bring the 6:3 ratio down, what you are doing is calming this aspect of immunological function. Now, if you completely suppress the functioning of different parts of the immune system, not a good idea, because at that point you become more at risk of various infectious complications and other even more serious health issues. So we would suggest, I would recommend, that if you are really trying to stop all chronic inflammatory damage in the body whatsoever, if, for example, you're trying to deal with a cancer, in which case reducing inflammatory stress is a very good idea, because we know that the chronic inflammation is involved in angiogenesis, tumorigenesis, and metastatic spread. Under those conditions, you certainly do not want to blunt the immune response. And so I would think that it is essential to start looking at other tools and combining the balance with things like the 1,3,1,6 beta-glucans and a cyanogen and a number of other trace elements and vitamins that we know are absolutely essential specifically for innate immune function. Why innate? Because that's actually more important in keeping you healthy most of the time than the adaptive immune system is.
Yeah, and I've heard you talk about that clearly before, and we will talk about extend in just a moment, and clearly there is an overlap, and I fully understand that. Okay, like I say, got a number of questions, and I do want to just get through these, particularly on balance oil, because there were a lot more than some of the other therapies, some of the other product areas. This is an interesting. One of my partners is working within the business where he's working in a fostering agency, working very much with children, and some of the conversations that have been had with some of the clinical psychologists have been related to the relationship between inflammation and emotional trauma. So he's very interested, if you could just explore, do we have any anecdotal evidence of the balanced oil's impacts on behaviors or emotional traumas? And indeed, an extension to that question is, you know, generally in terms of the improvement in brain function and in particular things like ADHD. So quite an extensive question, but if you could answer that reasonably concisely, that'd be great.
But the question itself has got a lot of sub-questions in it.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that.
Let me unpack them. I think when it comes to the neurodevelopmental conditions, ranging all the way from ADD, ADHD, dysphagia, dyspraxia, autism, Asperger's, and all the rest of them, there is a reasonable clinical literature that indicating that the omega-3s may be useful in alleviating the symptoms of some, in fact, of all of these cases. I think that for a variety of reasons, because we know that the polyphenols are picked up by a number of different areas of the brain. In fact, polyphenol receptors have been characterized by a scientist at the University of Helsinki. I have reason to believe that the combining the omega-3s with the polyphenols may be a more effective approach. Quite apart from the fact that with the polyphenols in place, we can deliver higher levels of omega-3s into the central nervous system, into the cell membranes there. Now, it's not just an issue of membrane function. We're also having an effect on endocannabinoid metabolism, which is involved. And we are following up this approach with a clinical trial. We're working with a group of quite well-known pediatricians and neurodevelopmental people in the Czech Republic. They are giving balance oil in a controlled program to children with these particular types of conditions, and then we are going to be monitoring the results. Ethics committee approval has been applied for. We hope to obtain it in the next few months, and then we'll actually start recruiting into a formal study. What we have at the moment are simply case histories. The case histories that I have seen are extremely impressive, both in the Czech Republic and in other countries where I've had some exposure to this. And what we find is we get extremely good results with balanced oil, and we get even better results when we combine this with xenobiotic. Now, you're aware, I'm sure, that in many of these children, there is evidence of some kind of dysregulation of the microbiome. People talk about leaky gut, various types of intolerances that can go along with this. We find that by combining balanced oil and xenobiotic, we get extremely good results. I mean, in quite a lot of these children, what we're actually seeing is something that is almost like normalization. And so the responses from parents and in many cases teachers have been overwhelming. Just case histories, lowest level of data, of proof. I mean, it's just smoke, but there's so much smoke that I'm pretty certain there's a fire going on, and that's what the clinical trial in the Czech Republic is designed to try and ferret out. PTSD, a very different area, obviously, but we know that there is evidence for a degree of inflammatory stress in PTSD. And here we're working with a group of American veterans, military veterans with PTSD in Minnesota. Again, the anecdotal data, the case histories that we're generating at the moment are wildly positive. But I think what we need to do is to examine this in a more formal way. We have this program of prospective clinical trials we will be rolling out. The first one is actually a cardiovascular series of endpoints. But these other types of areas, the ones you just touched on, are part of our program going forwards. Now we know that inflammatory stress is implicated in depressive illness. There is quite a good literature that supports the use of omega-3s to treat different types of depression. Anything that the omega-3s will do, balanced oil will do more effectively, simply because we're getting better delivery into the CNS. And so I think there's a reasonable case to be made for recommending the use of balanced oil as an antidepressant. Again, I wouldn't necessarily use it on its own. In this situation, we would routinely combine it with Viva, which is the saffron extract, which is working in a slightly different way. but in a way that apparently synergizes with the impact of the omega-3s. Now, the saffron extract, this standardized extract, contains some rather atypical carotenoids, a couple of interesting polyphenols as well. And the effective dose, which is very, very low. I mean, you've seen how small the tablets are, is very effective because these compounds are not simply distributed within the body. There's an active uptake system in the brain which will pick these molecules up and deliver them to the VTA, the ventral tegmental area, which is in the hypothalamus. And this very small area in the midbrain, in the hypothalamus, is where the neuronal substrate of a behavioral parameter called resilience resides. Now, some of you will be familiar with resilience, perhaps others less so. Resilience describes your ability to overcome adversity. So when you're faced with a really difficult challenge or set of circumstances, people who are resilient will be able to cope. They don't fold. They will fight harder, find a strategy, and deal with it. They will overcome that obstacle. Other people will give up. And along with that goes feelings of helplessness, the inability to control one's life. And that is really quite central to depressive illness and to anxiety states as well. Now, the very specific subgroup of neurons in this VTA have been identified, as have the transmembrane ion channels and the receptors around these channels, which can be manipulated. You can do this manipulation in various ways. Various types of psychological training have the ability to do this. Ketamine, special K, is being used by the American military to treat PTSD because it works in this area as well. And guess what? The compounds in saffron do exactly the same thing as Avicenna first describes in his canons of medicine in the 10th and 11th centuries. And the saffron extracts have, as I think you know, been put through, I think, 17 or 18 clinical trials now, and shown to be as effective as an SSRI in reducing depression and anxiety, and doing so far more effectively, where the SSRIs take typically 2, 3, sometimes even 4 weeks to become clinically meaningful. And in that time, all kinds of terrible things can go wrong. The saffron extract is effective within about 60 minutes. And that tells you right away that the old monoamine hypothesis model of depression is wrong. And we can go into that later. The effect of saffron is much cleaner. There's really no side effects at all. And there's no withdrawal symptoms. So you can stop whenever you want. Now, the SSRI market is a wonderful market for the drug industry because they don't really resolve anything. You have to take them for long periods of time. And if you do manage to get your life back on tracks, and you don't want to take those drugs anymore. The withdrawal symptoms can be absolutely crippling. In some cases affecting up to 50% of the people who use that particular SSRI. And so people don't want to come off. They stay on them, and that's great business. With the saffron extract, you can stay on it as long as you like, come off, no withdrawal effects, none whatsoever. So it's great, works very rapidly, very, very clean, very, very safe. And in all these respects, it is far, far better than these crude synthetic spanners that the pharmaceutical industry insists on trying to throw into the incredibly complicated workings of the human brain. So I like saffron, particularly the standardized extracts that we're now using. And from a business perspective, I think it's worth saying that we have exclusivity for this extract within the direct marketing channel. No one else can use it. I will also tell you that the company who make this extract, and these are friends of mine, I've been in this area for so long that I know almost everybody, are now working with a major pharmaceutical company who love the idea of adding the saffron extract to their antidepressant, an SSRI, which is going out of patent now. So they can then get a new patent for the SSRI saffron combination. They can sell it to their captive market, and by that I mean physicians, as a new and at least partly natural product. And the clinical trials actually show that when you combine saffron with an SSRI, the adverse effects of the SSRI are reduced. So there's lots of people who are using these drugs already, and you can say to them legitimately, look, here is something that you can take alongside your SSRI, which will make the SSRI's adverse effects more manageable. And it will also mean that when you decide to stop taking it, you won't have as many withdrawal effects. I mean, this is such, it's really a wonderful extract. I can't say enough good things about it. I was involved in one of the relatively early clinical trials, which we did in Australia, and further clinical work is underway.
That's fantastic. And I love the way you've actually talked about saffron and Viva in particular, because obviously it's on our list of products we want to talk about this afternoon, but you've pretty much covered a lot of it. And I have to say, Paul, that was one of my questions, which was your suggestions and advice in terms of using balance oil, because we know the therapeutic benefits that we have in terms of the DHA on the brain and so on and so forth. But in terms of combining that with Viva, then there's absolutely no reason why that wouldn't would be a good suggestion for certain conditions.
I don't like the idea of making people chemically dependent, and the pharmaceutical industry does. I mean, that is its core concept. They're not interested in cures because cures they're not economically viable. Mm. They're interested in compounds that can be used for long periods of time. I mean, this is why there's been so little research into new antibiotics the last 2 decades. Every now and then something comes through, but the money isn't in antibiotics because you only use a short course.
Yeah, absolutely.
Most people do. So the basic business model of the pharmaceutical industry, it rests on this concept of chronic illness and using non-curative treatments, which will at least allay the symptoms, but you're going to need to take them for the rest of your life. I mean, that is good business. I don't think it's good science.
No, but clearly, in terms of the benefits we have, just on a comparison to that with a non-pharmaceutical product, we're looking at balance oil, then many people will take that for the rest of their lives, but with very, very good reason.
Well, I don't think they should have to take it for the rest of their lives. I mean, the only reason why there is a rationale for using these types of pharmaconutritional programs or strategies, if you like, is because all those good things which used to be in the diet have been taken out of modern ultra-processed foods. If the multinational food industry were to assume its responsibilities and stop selling us this shoddy, toxic industrial fodder that passes for food today, then we would not be necessary. And I look forward to a day when the food industry will be forced to assume a more responsible approach and actually start selling us foods that are healthy rather than toxic. And at that point, we will no longer be necessary.
Yeah, I understand that. And I've heard you talk about that before. And that will be the revolution, like you say, that the world will see in terms of the changes in the food manufacturing processes. And unfortunately, it may not happen in my lifetime. It may not happen in your lifetime, but I'm sure we may see those changes coming at some point in the future. Paul, can I focus on an area that's very close to my heart and look at the CBD, the cannabidiol? I've done a lot of research on that myself and seen very excitedly the crossover, if you like, between CBD and omega-3. Could you expand on that for us a little bit, please?
Well, the cannabinoids are not really my area of expertise. I mean, having said that, many years ago, I did actually used to work for the CIA. And that, of course, as anybody who has ever been to Amsterdam knows, stands for Cannabis International Amsterdam. We used to hold the Cannabis Cup on an annual basis. And this was back in the 60s when, you know, the world was a different place. I remember those conferences with great fondness. I mean, the bits of it that I can't remember. So CBD, yep, very interesting and clearly effective in the anti-inflammatory area. The effects are transient. They're acute. This is, in my view, a little bit more like it's a little bit more like the pharmaceutical approach in the sense that you're dealing with symptoms and you have to keep on prodding away at it. What I'm trying to do is to realign your entire metabolism with the approach is what we're doing. But I'm not precious about this. We're not exclusive about it. And what I do see is that CBD in someone who has serious inflammatory symptoms, it actually works very well with balance oil. And there are regulatory issues about this at the moment. The opening up of the American market has not been problem-free, and there are certainly very powerful elements in the FDA, which is largely owned by the pharmaceutical industry, if I'm being honest, who would like to roll the this regulatory climate back again and start taking CBD products off the market. And the situation in the EU, the regulators in the EU, EFSA, are looking very carefully at what the FDA are doing, and they don't want to be too far out of step with them. So it's a little difficult to see what is actually going to be happening in the market for the next couple of years. I think eventually the CBD things will becoming, will gain a legitimate place in the public sector. And at that point, we will consider including certain CBD, cannabis extract in our balanced oil products to give them that more rapid onset of action. Having said that, we have other alternatives. There are a number of other compounds which we are already looking at, which are, from a regulatory perspective, acceptable, which we are looking at putting into our balanced oil products, for example, for a starter pack. So in the first couple of bottles, you might have this advanced version, which means you get into the anti-inflammation, anti-pain, all that stuff very, very rapidly. And at that point, once your 6-3 ratios and your cell membranes are at the right kind of level, you could then taper off and move on to the basic balance oil to keep you there. So all these strategies are, we're looking at all of them.
That's fantastic, actually, and that's very exciting, actually, Paul. Very exciting indeed. Okay, and just I'm going to finish off in terms of a couple of questions finally on balance oil, if I may. One is related to the dosing again, which was, what would you consider a sort of safe maintenance dose? Would you consider that somebody who's been, let's say, for example, on a 15 mils to begin with, would you consider them staying on the 15 mil, or would you suggest them titrating down to a slightly lower dose for the maintenance dose going forward once they're back in balance?
You know what, people generally titrate their own dose, because you take the dose that you need to get into the therapeutic range until your symptoms, whatever they are, have disappeared. And then you can find out for yourself, like, can I cut the dose a little bit? Because maybe you want to make the bottle stretch further, you want to do the whole thing more economically. Go until you cut it down by 10% and see if you stay in the therapeutic zone for the next few months, or take another blood test, if you will, and find out exactly where you are. And incidentally, maybe I should talk about this as well. I think this idea of testing is really important. In fact, it's central to evidence-based nutrition. I don't want to just recommend people do things and, okay, you tell me you feel better or you don't, but then there's the placebo effect and people forget how they were to begin with anyway. I don't think that's a very good basis. I do think it's important to have this testability element in the system, so that if you want to take something, you can actually measure exactly what it's doing in the body. And that approach is something we're going to be rolling out for the rest of our range as well. We already have a test, which we will probably be putting into the packing along with Aviva at some near future point. And we also have a test, which I've been working on with some other scientists at the University of Oslo, where we will be able to demonstrate, for example, that your microbiome has flipped from gram-negative dominance to gram-positive, and has created, and you've switched from a pro-inflammatory milieu within the large intestine to an anti-inflammatory milieu. For the techies, I can tell you that what we're going to be looking at is the ratio between butyrate and lipopolysaccharide. Now, if you know your stuff, you know exactly what that means, but fundamentally what it means is we have a way of showing and measuring the fact that you've gone from a situation where you previously had a pro-inflammatory milieu or environment in the large intestine, it is now anti-inflammatory. And you can then see for yourself that as this shifts, whatever symptoms, whatever health problems you had, also will shift in parallel. Again, this concept of testability. We're not just asking you to buy a pig in the poke. We think that if you are getting to the point where you want to go on this journey with us, you should be able to document exactly what's going on and see for yourself. Prove these things for yourself.
No, thank you, Paul. That's perfect, because the testing has been a section of what I want to talk about this afternoon, because clearly it makes up part of our product portfolio, test-led pharmaconutrition, but you've answered most of that beautifully, and we can talk about, if we may do in a moment, that test with the prebiotic. Finally, on balanced oil, cradle to grave, that's something I talk to everybody about, and I know it's talked about in the business. I've heard you present on that when I was in Sweden. just in terms of that, what dose would you suggest for babies? At what point would you suggest the introduction of balance oil? And at what point would you cease it? I think Cradle to Grave pretty much covers it, but could you expand on that briefly, please?
Well, if mum is using balance oil and is in balance, then the baby, while it's growing in the womb, will have access to enough omega-3s to build its brain in a way that we think is optimal. And if that baby is then breastfed after birth, then the breast milk, which is actually very good at giving the baby what it needs, if it's designed to do that, will make sure that the baby has enough of the right omega-3s and omega-6s as well in the milk so that its brain will continue to develop after birth. After weaning, the whole situation changes, and there are, I'm afraid, a lot of manufacturers of infant formula who have not yet got on board with the omega-3s, but increasingly they are starting to do that. So I would say, choose an infant formula which has had omega-3 LCPs added to it. I think from an evolutionary perspective, from a historical perspective, it seems to me to make sense to have a good omega-3 to 6 balance all the way through life. I think teenagers probably aren't going to have chronic degenerative disease. They may have genetic illnesses, but what we see is for example, in autopsy victims, road traffic accident victims, we see that in the developed nations, young people in their 30s or even 20s, you will see that they have fatty streaks in the linings of their arteries. We know they're starting to go down that road towards coronary artery disease. We know that very significant numbers of so-called healthy young and middle-aged subjects, people who think they're healthy, have no clinical symptoms, already do have the early preclinical signs of degenerative conditions which are gradually, slowly growing under the surface and which will eventually come to the surface and either disable them or cause symptoms of one sort or another or kill them. So it seems to me to make sense to rectify these problems of chronic inflammatory stress and type B malnutrition basically throughout life. And what will happen if you do that? Well, I think that a large part of the aging process slows down, not all of it. There are a whole range of different aging subroutines. You can talk about telomeric shortening, mitochondrial senescence, reduced expression of mRNA, splicing factors. But the largest part of the aging process, as it affects most of us, is in fact the progressive destruction of the extracellular matrix. And that is where chronic inflammation, chronic inflammatory stress operates. So if you can stop that, then you're starting to interfere with a very substantial part of the aging process itself. And that way lies health extension. And if you extend health as a byproduct of that, you're starting to extend life expectancy as well. So I don't aim at life expectancy per se. I aim at health expectancy, and increased life expectancy comes along as a byproduct of that. What can you achieve? Well, I think that the data coming out of the blue zones, both historical and contemporary, gives us an indication that many aspects of the aging process that we formerly thought of as being intrinsic are not at all intrinsic. They can be stripped away. For myself, I think I'm a reasonable example of healthy aging, as is known as successful aging. I mean, my blood pressure, and I don't take medication, is, I think the last time I looked at it, it's 118 over 66, with a resting heart rate of about 52. And that's pretty much where I was when I left university.
Yeah, well, that's incredible.
I mean, but there's other things as well, but I don't want to go into that. But my own personal experience is that some of the aging process, at least, can be slowed.
You're walking testimony to that, Paul. You really are. I can assure you of that. Those sort of blood tests, your blood pressure results as well, it's quite extraordinary. But, okay, I hope my microphone is clear still. Can I just staying briefly, and I really would like to move on to extend, but there's so much around, obviously, our range of balance oils. It's a lot of questions. Can you just, again, briefly explain a few questions? I'll put them into one and maybe you can answer it. So the number of naturally occurring lipophilic polyphenols within the fish oil that are left after the extraction process, is there anything left? And what is you have answered it partly earlier on today, but what is the element of heavy metals that are left within the balance oil, if any?
They're below detection limits.
Okay. Right, and then so that's the heavy metals, and in terms of what's left in terms of the naturally occurring polyphenol like combination that's found in the omega-3, is there anything left at all?
Well, the naturally occurring polyphenols they're compounds called fluorotannins, and they have a fairly distinct organoleptic profile. By that I mean they smell and they taste in a particular way. Not everybody likes that. And so we simply take this rather high precision fish oil that is, which we get from Lisi, which is an Icelandic company. And then what we do is, I think you know, is we add this very high polyphenol, which is a pre-harvest olive oil, to it. Now, the interesting thing about olive oil is that its polyphenols are, in physicochemical terms, they're very, very similar to the polyphenols that you find in these cold water marine algae. They do the same job. And we've monitored this along with SINTAC, which is a Norwegian governmental agency, looking at the ability of these olive polyphenols to protect the omega-3s in different oxidative stress situations. And I mean, they're extraordinarily effective. I mean, amazingly effective. They're so, alpha tocopherol, which is what a lot of other commercial products use, is not the right antioxidant at all. It can be a pro-oxidant in many circumstances, and it simply doesn't give you the protection you need for these very fragile omega-3 molecules. When we ran the test with the olive polyphenols, basically we just said, okay, it's perfect protection up to 36 hours, and we couldn't extend the trial any longer than that because that's when the technicians said, we give up, we're going home. That's it. Now, how much better does it do than 36 hours? Well, you can try this for yourself by opening a bottle and putting it in the fridge, keeping it cold. I mean, let's not make things too hard. But you'll find that after it's been in the fridge for a month, if you've opened it every day, taken some out, even after 3-4 weeks, it's not rancid.
No.
And if you try that trick with a typical omega-3 alpha tocopherol blend, you won't get that same end result.
Okay, that's really interesting. And again, I've heard you talk about the carrier. I just got one question left on carrier and dosage, and then we can move on to extend. In terms of the carrier being, say, vitamin E, I'm aware that you've talked about that being good, if you like, at stopping oxidation in the bottle, but not once it enters into the human body. Could you just explain the lipophilic polyphenol prevention of oxidation briefly in terms of just how that process works, why it is just so effective? Again, just briefly, if you would, Paul.
Well, I mean, we're simply copying nature. When the marine algae produce these long-chain omega-3 molecules, which are very fragile, they also produce the polyphenols, which the plant needs to stop from oxidizing while it's inside the algae, which would, of course, kill the algae. And they're so good at protecting the omega-3s. They co-migrate with them through the entire food chain. And it may take, a year for those omega-3s to get from the seaweed to the krill, the pelagic fish, the large fish, the marine mammals, the apex predators. And there is no other antioxidant on Earth that we know of that would be able to protect the omega-3s for such long periods of time. These polyphenols have two characteristics. They are highly lipophilic. They get into the omega-3s and stay there. But they have one other characteristic that makes them really interesting. They have a high affinity for proline and hydroxyproline amino acid residues, which you find, of course, in the lipoproteins. So when you eat these omega-3s, the polyphenols are there, and they get into the lipoprotein particles, bind onto the proteins, onto the apoproteins there, and co-migrate with the omega-3s right up until the point they're deposited in the tissues. We're simply replicating nature. And that's all we're doing. With D-alpha, we're using, or the industry uses, well, they took the antioxidant off the shelf because that's what they had. But the problem is with D-alpha tocopherol is that under a number of different conditions, it becomes a pro-oxidant. And once you swallow that omega-3 capsule, if you have co-ingested it with heme or iron, if you've eaten a meal containing animal protein, for example, then the vitamin E becomes a pro-oxidant. If you have periodontal disease, a peptic ulcer, there's heme in the system. It breaks down the omega-3s because that E is now pro-oxidant. When these things are traveling through the systemic circulation, they're passing through the lungs with every tour. And if you have a respiratory tract infection, there will be heme present as well, and a high partial pressure of oxygen. Under those conditions, these very vulnerable long-chain omega-3s break down as well. And these are the reasons why, when we go through our database of cell membrane samples, we find that in people who've been religiously chugging omega-3 alpha-tocopherol combinations for years, for decades in some cases, they have terrible 6:3 ratios in their membranes because the omega-3s never got to the right place. And the worry is they didn't get to the right place because they were being oxidized. And so all these people who were taking omega-3 supplements to stay well were actually exposing themselves to excessive oxidative stress. Right. I think that the fish oil industry has really gone down a very wrong road. And at some point, you know, as the science becomes more accepted, I wouldn't be surprised to see some major lawsuits.
Yeah, I've heard you express that before. And when you look at 1 billion people across the globe as an estimate, and it's probably more than that, taking omega-3 supplements, and guesstimate, you know, say 10 million people in the UK or around that sort of figure, taking what you're saying is an omega-3 that in many ways just doesn't work.
And may even be harming them. Wait for that evidence to come out, and then I think all hell's going to break loose.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Okay, and finally, just a very simple question on when is the best time to take balanced oil, and is it best to be taken with food?
With most supplements, it's better to take them with food because that puts the gut into an active absorptive state. You'll tend to get better uptake. Time of day doesn't really matter, but don't take balanced oil too closely before or after intense exercise, because under those conditions, the body will grab those fatty acids and it will start burning them for energy rather than incorporating them into the tissues.
Okay, lovely. Thank you, Paul. Right, moving on. Extend and Extend Plus. That's fantastic on balanced oil. Again, we're talking about what you describe as the orchestra of products that help with the immune system and so on and so forth. I'm aware of time, and although I think we all would love to hear far more of what you have to say. So if we can expand again on the pharmacology and the mode of action of Extend and Extend Plus, and specifically in relation to the immune system as well. And then I have a few questions for you, far less at the end of that, if you would, please, Paul.
Right. We have, I think, another 10 or maybe 15 minutes tops before I have to jump onto another Zoom call.
That's okay. That's absolutely fine. No worries at all. It was allowing about an hour and a half.
Okay. Well, Extend, the reason why it's called Extend was that it was originally designed to protect against disease X. Now, some of you might know what this is. For those who don't, disease X is the rather nightmarish hypothetical disease that the WHO dreamt up, I think 8 or 9 years ago. And it was this pandemic that would arise at some point, which would combine high transmission rates with high virulence, the Andromeda strain, if you will. And that would be, you know, the end game. That would be the end of us. And the reason why they were sort of talking about this sort of thing was that it's been quite obvious that for the last 3 decades or so, the frequency of emergent diseases, emergent infectious diseases, has steadily increased. By emergent, what I'm talking about, these are zoonotic infections that arise in animal species, and they've been emerging into the human population more and more frequently, partly because we think of increased urbanization, which has created population pressures resulting in humans coming into contact with small and remote groups of animal species that they haven't done before, creating opportunities for these viruses to make the trans-species jump into the human population. And then, you know, we're crowded and we share our pathogens with each other. And we also live in an age of rapid mass transit between the continents. So it's perfectly possible to acquire a dangerous new pathogen on one side of the world and deliver it to the other side of the world before you even know you're symptomatic. And that's happened with COVID-19, but you know, the coronavirus is clearly not a bioweapon because it's completely ineffective for a bioweapon. It's just probably the result of experimentation that was, I think, had a therapeutic intention, some of which was done at Fort Detrick here in the United States, and some of which was done in Wuhan, but at other sites as well. The current American attempts to pin it all on Wuhan is the typical bluster and idiocy that you've come to associate with all American administrations, not just this one. They're looking for a stick to beat China with. But I don't think that I think the Chinese were taken completely off guard by this. And if you look at the history of pandemics of this sort, what you'll see is that it's almost always the case that the countries where these problems first emerge take too long to deal with it because they don't know what the hell it is. The countries which then become involved later, further downstream, tend to overreact. Very few governments get it right because mostly we seem to elect morons and sociopaths, and not to mention crooks. Not enough scientists, in my view. So disease X was almost always, it was always going to be a virus. And I was interested to look at this prospect of creating a formula which would improve our ability to deal with viral infections of any kind. If you look at the way in which the body defends itself against infection, the most important component or subsystem in the immune system is the innate immune system. And whereas the defenses against bacteria are largely, not exclusively, cellular, involving macrophages, neutrophils, things like that, the immune defenses against viruses are rather different. They are primarily chemical. Those of you who know about this will want to talk about natural killer cells and B cells, but NK cells are not a very good defense, and B cells only become involved much, much later on. The defenses against viruses are largely chemical. And you can't kill a virus because they're not exactly alive to start with. They exist on this borderline between organic life and inorganic or crystalline physics. But you can damage the viral structure to the point where it can no longer go through its cycle of cellular entry, multiplication, and explosion, release, and then further infection. And the body has an array of chemicals that it can produce, which are designed to damage the viral coat so that it can no longer be infectious. And oddly enough, that's what Donald Trump was talking about yesterday, because I know what he was talking about with the other medics and scientists there. The newspapers then said, oh, it's crazy, you can't give people disinfectants. The body makes its own disinfectants. That's what Trump was actually referring to, but he's so inarticulate, he basically balls it up. The body makes 4 chemical compounds in particular, more than the 4 actually, but the 4 that seem to be most important are hydrogen peroxide, and that's what Trump was referring to, hypochlorous acid, hypothiocyanate, which is a pseudohalide, and hypoiodide. And the body's ability to make these, they're all mild pro-oxidants, they're all capable of damaging the virus to the point where it can no longer infect new cells. Absolutely depends on quite a small and tightly defined group of micronutrients. So they include the 1,3,1,6 beta-glucans, which are a very atypical, essential micronutrient, which are very, very important for the ability of the neutrophils, macrophages, and Langerhans cells, and Kupffer cells, and all those other innate immune cells to produce hydrogen peroxide and hypochlorous acid. But in order to do that, they also need iron and manganese. Absolutely critical. And then what happens is, once the hydrogen peroxide has been formed, that switches on LPO, which is an innate immune system enzyme, lactoperoxidase. And lactoperoxidase will then start with hydrogen peroxide, and it will take thiocyanate groups and iodine and turn them into hypothiocyanate and hypoiodide. And that kills or destroys or damages viruses even more effectively. But in order to do that, the enzyme requires thiocyanate groups and iodine. Now, iodine population status has been declining for the last 10 years, partly because of the fact that people are going on to low salt diets, or they're using sea salt, which is non-iodinated. So the sterling efforts of the WHO and other groups like that to ensure adequate iodination status worldwide to prevent cretinism, goiter, and all the rest of it, some of that has been undone. And the population iodine levels are in decline, and that damages this part of the innate immune system response. These cyanogens that used to be present in the diet in large amounts, typically cyanogenic glycosides or glucosinolates, which the LPO enzyme also needs, they've declined as well, tremendously, for all kinds of other reasons. So both of our cells, the cells that are involved here, and the enzyme systems are completely disabled, which means we're far more vulnerable to viral infection. You also need selenium and vitamin D, both of which play a role in the modulation of interferons. And the interferons are in this sort of slightly odd area. They overlap with the innate immune function and the adaptive immune system as well. But they are able to downregulate viral DNA and RNA replication, as is zinc. But you need other things to be able to get the zinc into the cells, and specifically, you need polyphenols, which assist with the ingress of zinc into the cells, where it also inhibits viral DNA and RNA replication. And guess what? Polyphenols and zinc and everything else, all of these levels are at an all-time low because of the modern industrial diet. We're already seeing, I think, patterns which are telling us how important these are, because if you look at the emergent mortality profiles in different parts of America, it's very, very clear. And also in Britain, I should say, it's very, very clear that in people who are in the poorer areas, and people who are eating a poorer diet, they're dying at about 10 times the rates that you're seeing in wealthier communities who are eating a very different diet indeed. The more processed foods and ultra-processed foods you eat, the worse your nutritional profile, the more you're going to die. The converse is, if you're eating the right kinds of foods, the more you're likely to be protected. And if we're talking about coronavirus, so, you know, this is not disease X, not by a long chalk, but it looks as if about 50, 60, maybe 70%, maybe, of all the people who acquire this virus have no symptoms at all. That's one of the reasons it is not a very good bioweapon. Maybe 30% will get symptoms, but of those 30%, about 80, 90% of them will clear the virus themselves, because the innate immune system, even if it's not working very well, is still going to be working well enough. Maybe less than 10% of that 30% are going to require, they're going to be hospitalized, they're going to require tertiary or quaternary healthcare support. And then we put them on ventilators and we kill 90% of those, because ventilators clearly are not an appropriate treatment. What is it that determines whether you have the initial infection, have a transient viremia, and then turn left and recover, or in the small number of people go on to get sick? Well, what we know is that the people who tend to get sick are those people who are older, who are morbidly obese, who have hypertension, diabetes, a number of other conditions. And guess what? That is the same population that almost inevitably has worse nutritional status. So their innate immune systems simply aren't working as well in the first place. I think if you were to make sure that your innate immune system had everything that it needed to deal with viral threats, then your ability to resist that infection, to deal with it, and to heal spontaneously, to recover spontaneously, I think is going to be dramatically greater. And
cool.
everything, all of those micronutrients, every single one that I talked about, was put into Extend because, as I said, that was designed to protect us from disease X, which doesn't yet exist.
Beautifully explained. You've covered a lot of the questions, and again, I'm aware we've got about 10 minutes. Am I right? So I'm going to rattle through this.
We've got about 2 minutes, 3 minutes left. I have another Zoom. Scott.
Okay.
Make this the last question.
I'll make the okay. It was just the use of beta glucans within Extend, and if we can just look at the use of that within Xenobiotic as well, and pretty much the use of that together. So could you just explain that to us, please?
The beta glucans in Xenobiotic are entirely different.
Oh. I realised that was one of the questions. So the difference between the beta glucans in Extend and the difference in Xenobiotic.
Right. The beta glucans in Extend are derived from the cell walls of Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is baker's or brewer's yeast, and they are taken up from the gut in very, very small amounts. And what their function is to interact with CR3 receptors on your immune cells, making them more competent. The 1314 beta glucans in Xenobiotic are not taken up from the gut at all. They move into the large bowel, and they are then prebiotic fibers, where they are one of the prebiotic fibers we use to encourage the growth of gram-positive probiotic species in the gut.
Fine. Okay. And the use of the test, finally, we just move on to that, Paul, before you have to go through the call. I mean, very excitingly for us, we're looking at test-led pharmaconutrition, and you already touched on this. So the looking at the gram negative and the gram positive, so the lipopolysaccharide versus the butyrate, you've alluded to that. Is that something that is going to be coming online reasonably quickly, or is that very much still a work in progress?
Well, it's a work in progress. We have a very good team at the University of Oslo. But even although we can demonstrate this on a kind of a lab bench system, that has to be incorporated into a user-friendly test, a self-test. The idea is that we will put into every pack of Xenobiotic one of these tests that you can then take at home. And once again, you put it into the foil envelope, send it off to the lab. They do their differential analysis. And then a week or so later, it tells you, this is where you were to start with. Very low butyrate, very high lipopolysaccharide. Therefore, you were pro-inflammatory. After you used the Xenobiotic for a couple of days or a week, you can retake the test. And then what we can demonstrate to you is that the fundamental environment in the large intestine is now overwhelmingly anti-inflammatory. You will know that anyway, because any symptoms that you might have had of chronic inflammatory status there, both within the gut and also in many other areas of the body as well, you'll notice for yourself that your well-being has improved.
Okay.
But the test is simply there to confirm it and to put numbers on it.
Okay, lovely. I'm aware of your time. I know you're on the call, so I'm going to wrap up. Just to say, I think as a final overview, if you're utilizing the use of balance soil, which we discussed today, the use of Extend, and the use of Xenobiotic, then in combination, that is possibly the best combination of pharmaconutrition you could wish to have. Am I right in saying that?
At this time, I'm not saying it's the be all and end all. The science continues to evolve, and as it does, we will be there with it. So the products will develop going forwards. Okay,
Paul, thank you so much indeed for your time. Have you got any closing comments you'd like to make just before we say goodbye to everybody this afternoon?
No, I think I'd better go and retrieve the dog.
Okay, lovely. Listen, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it. It's been a pleasure interviewing you and talking to you as usual. I look forward to our conversations in the future. Thanks very much, Paul. And thank you, everybody.
It's a pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
As always, appreciate it. Take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.